Hello YouTube, this is Neon. Today I am going to be titling my talk, How African Americans Can Avoid Hiring Discrimination in the Private Sector, an Addendum. There's one important point that I left out. The African American who gave me most of the tips I'm giving here told me that when he did get the interview and walked in the office to be interviewed, that the person who was going to do the interview, that their body language, their facial expression, all of the nonverbals communicated to him that this person was nervous, was uncomfortable, did not expect to be interviewing an African American. They had to reposition themselves in the chair perhaps more than once, and they really had to compose themselves because they weren't expecting in their private sector world to be employing an African American. They didn't even expect that an African American would get to the point where they could even be interviewed. He said that he went through the interview, he did what any of us would do during an interview, which is to show that we are capable and qualified for doing the job, that we deserve the job, we merit the job because of our capability and qualifications. He told me that in one particular interview he got the job, and I believe he said that he worked for this private sector company for quite a few years. Now, all of the tips that I gave, which is don't call in and ask for a job, don't go into human resources or to the private sector company and ask for a job, don't put down your name. If your name is Afrocentric, just use initials and then use, unfortunately, most of us people of color, we have European last names, British last names. I find it very unfortunate, but use that last name, the last name that was given to us by those who raped and murdered and destroyed and stole and enslaved. Use that last name that comes from European barbarians, and then use initials for your Afrocentric first and or middle name. All of these tips that I gave, don't put African American on your job application. All of these tips I gave, again, I'm going to reiterate, it's humiliating, it's disgusting. We shouldn't have to do this to get a good job that we're qualified for in the private sector, where we have very real room for growth, very much more room for very much more earning potential than we have in the public sector where most educated African Americans work. I'm just saying, this is not me trying to say, deny that you're African American. This is me saying that if you don't do this, probably your resume is going to be tossed in the trash. Okay? I'm not categorically saying all whites don't want us in the same room with them, believe that they're superior, that the only thing we as African Americans serve for them is to feed their false sense of superiority. I'm not categorically saying that about whites. What I am saying is, I believe and am convinced that the majority, perhaps the vast majority, although not all, private sector companies, they do not want to hire African Americans in a capacity where they have room for growth that has the potential to lead to a CEO or to an executive position. They do not want to have to pay us really nice fat incomes. They don't consider us their equal, and so they are going to continue to perpetuate economic racism, which I believe is the one form of racism that's fairly easy to perpetrate in this day and age. And it is really just as effective almost as lynching. Because the more poor that you make a person, the more that person has to act out of desperation. So I stand by these chips, even though there may be some African Americans that get pissed off at me. I stand by these chips. These chips were given me by an African American. So I stand by these chips. I believe that the poverty that is in the ghetto, that is in the barrio, that is in the majority, to my understanding, the vast majority of Native American reservations, is the result of economic racism that is perpetrated by whites, or perhaps we could say by the majority persuasion against us. They need us to live in poverty, and they need us to have to act out of economic desperation so that we feed their false sense of superiority. They need that. And we already know poverty-stricken neighborhoods, overwhelmingly there's more crime, and there's more vice, and there's more people who act out of desperation. Until we get to the point of racial quotas in the private sector, and that means racial quotas at every level of employment, all the way up to the executive, big, fat, high-paying positions. Until we get to that point, until we get reparations, we're not going to have economic equality. We're going to have this overrepresentation of poverty that has been proven by African American economists who have put forth the stance, after a lot of study, that some of the majority persuasion that claims that most African Americans are living at middle class and above is in fact not true. They have to manipulate and play with the facts to try to make it look like most of us are not living near poverty or even below the poverty line or at the poverty line. They don't want change. Until then, we're going to have to force our way into the private sector world. As I said before, only 30% of African Americans who are educated work in the private sector. This is according to African American economists and experts on this subject, who I saw speaking in an interview. We have to force our way into the private sector, where there's all of this income potential and there's all this potential for growth that does not exist in the public sector world. There are whites, I call them freedom fighters, there are whites out there who want reparations for African Americans. They believe it's just justice. They're not doing anybody a favor. Okay? There are whites out there that want racial quotas. I believe that we as African Americans and we as people of color, we tend to reject whites. We don't want them to say anything. It doesn't even matter if we wholly agree with what they say. Our fear that they're going to try to take over, they're going to try to dictate, they're going to try to tell us what to do, because they actually believe that they too, even as economic progressives, that they too believe that they are superior to us, and they think they're going to dictate to us and they're going to set agendas. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true with those whites that are for reparations, or for those whites that are for racial quotas in the private sector. Of course, in the public sector as well. But I believe that we reject them, we take out our anger on them when we shouldn't be. As I said before, I'm not categorically saying anything about whites. I'm only saying what I have experienced personally with the vast majority of whites that I've gotten to know, and with what African Americans who have worked in the private sector have told me of their experience, as well as documentaries that I've seen on the hiring practices of private sector jobs. really, that's really the bulk of this addendum. I don't have much more to say. I'm thinking, is this a mail that I need to say? Because what is it? What might it be? Can you tell me? Can you tell me? I want to know. I said I want to know. But this is an important issue, in spite of the silliness. And I just think it needs to end. I think that the poverty and the circumstances in the ghetto, in the barrio, on the vast majority of Native American reservations in which people of color are living is just unjustified. I consider it economic oppression, and I believe it's going to be the last frontier of the civil rights movement, that we have a redistribution of wealth, whether it be reparations or racial quotas in the private sector, but that we have a redistribution of wealth in this country so that so many people of color aren't living in poverty. Here's a point that I had on homelessness. A person who I believe was an expert was saying that the percentage of whites that wind up being homeless is much smaller than the percentage of African Americans, and I believe of Latinos as well, because most whites have someone, a family member or a friend that they can contact that can help them financially in hard times. And they said that most African Americans don't. They don't have a friend or a family member that really has the money to help them when they hit hard times. And that's why there's a bigger percentage of African Americans that wind up being homeless. So this is an example of what economic oppression and economic racism does. It turns out to be very effective. It's almost effective as lynching when it comes to destroying people's lives. So that was a point that I did want to make in this as well. We need economic equality, and we need it peacefully, and we don't need a communist takeover to get it. So that's about it. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, share, comment, commercials, recommend my videos, do one or more of those things. Thank you, and best wishes.